Lewis Thomas McFadden was born in 1876, the son of Theodore and Julia Babb McFadden, who had settled in Granville Township, Bradford County in 1872. In 1887, at age 11, Lewis lost his mother Julia, who died at the young age of 37. The home was broken up, and Lewis lived for a time with Dr. T.A. Gamble in East Troy, attending school there and in Burlington Township when not employed at farm work. In 1892, at age 16, Lewis lost his father Theodore, who died at the age of 50. This left Lewis entirely alone in the world, with no family and no means to support himself. Dr. Gamble wished to make Lewis a physician, but Lewis was dreaming of bigger things. At age 18, Lewis sought employment and found it as an office boy and a janitor at the First National Bank of Canton, located on the first floor of the Lewis Building on Main Street, which was on the present site of the Chemung Canal Trust Company and South Center Street. For this job, he would earn $15 a month. As history records, he was entrusted with the keys to the building and got around early in the morning to sweep out and polish the windows and sweep off the sidewalks. In a few months, he evolved to a bookkeeper and then teller. Lewis McFadden married Lucy Helen Westgate on October 12, 1898, at the First Presbyterian Church in Canton, and would have 3 children. In 1899, Lewis was elected cashier of the First National Bank. He was 23 years old and the youngest cashier of any bank in Pennsylvania at the time. He was elected to this position solely on the merit of his excellence of past work. During his life, McFadden joined several groups, including the Sons of the American Revolution, the Masonic lodges in Canton, Troy, Williamsport, and Wilkes-Barre. He was a 32nd degree Mason and member of the Knights Templar and other organizations. Later, he would be a member of several boards, including the Robert Packer Hospital in Sayre, the Pittsburgh, Binghamton, and Eastern Railroad, which later went bankrupt before it was completed. McFadden was a member of the Pennsylvania State Bankers Association, where he would work his way up to president. As chairman of the association's Agriculture Committee, he cooperated with the Pennsylvania State College in carrying the college to the people by the aid of farm bureaus. Due to his involvement with the college, McFadden was later appointed as a trustee to the Pennsylvania State College to fill the place made vacant by the late Governor James A. Beaver. In 1916, McFadden was an organizer of the Pennsylvania State Chamber of Commerce, of which he became a director. The organization still exists today as the Pennsylvania Chamber of Business and Industry. In January of 1914, it was announced that Lewis McFadden had purchased Moreland Park east of Canton for his residence at a cost of $1, and that extensive repairs and improvements were to be made to the house. He intended to occupy the house around April 1st. About a week later, he announced that he would be candidate for Congress in the 14th Congressional District, which included Bradford, Wyoming, Susquehanna, and Wayne counties. Today, this area is known as the 10th Congressional District. This was not the first time that he had run. When George W. Kipp died in office in 1911, several friends suggested that he run for Congress. He became a candidate, but withdrew his name in the interest of party harmony. This time he was acting on the advice of hundreds of friends who believed the district needed a man of strong personality, absolutely free from promises, bargains, and entangling political alliances. McFadden's father had been a Democrat, but Lewis chose to be a Republican at a young age. He considered himself a liberal, progressive member of the party. The Williamsport Gazette and Bulletin said, quote, "With the clearest insight regarding financial affairs, he would be an invaluable addition to Pennsylvania's delegation in the next Congress, at a time when the new currency scheme is being tried out, and when changes in and amendments to the present law are almost inevitable." End quote. This is speaking of the Federal Reserve Act, which had just been enacted in December 1913 and had set up the Federal Reserve System. On May 23, 1914, the Bradford chapter Daughters of the American Revolution sponsored a special appearance of Elbert Hubbard, who would present his lecture, Earning a Living, at the Lewis Opera House in Canton. He was presented on stage by Mrs. Lewis McFadden. Hubbard was known around the world as a writer, lecturer, publisher, and editor. Most importantly, Hubbard founded Roycroft in 1895, a reformist community of craft workers and artists which formed part of the arts and crafts movement in the United States. The community was located in the village of East Aurora, Erie County, New York. Participants were known as Roycrofters. The Roycrofters published a number of books, including the popular Little Journeys, which described the homes of authors, musicians, artists, and philosophers. After Hubbard's visit to Canton in the midst of McFadden's campaign for Congress in 1914, he was inspired to write A Little Journey to Canton, PA. The booklet presents McFadden as a businessman rather than a congressman, something that this area was looking for at the time. Hubbard concludes the booklet with the words, quote, "Surely we need men in Congress of the Lewis T. McFadden type and kind. Here is a man who is not a professional office seeker, who will never misrepresent the common people. He is one with the hopes and aspirations of our forefathers who founded this government and who firmly believed that a government of the people and by the people and for the people shall not perish from the earth." End quote. How could you refuse to vote for a man like that? In June of 1914, the Bradford County Republican Committee met in Towanda. During the meeting, Honorable A.C. Fanning called attention to the fact that Lewis T. McFadden was in the room and asked the chairman to call upon McFadden for remarks. During his speech, McFadden criticized the Democratic administration's foreign policy known as watchful waiting, which was initiated during the Mexican Revolution by President Woodrow Wilson. Wilson wanted the U.S. to remain neutral, but he subsequently had to send troops into Mexico after Pancho Villa attacked Columbus, New Mexico, and killed 18 Americans. In August of 1914, the Reporter-Journal newspaper of Towanda wrote, quote, "The county is sick of the Democrats, and this will be shown in the congressional elections this fall. A Republican congressman will be chosen in the 14th District." End quote. The prediction was accurate. The 14th Congressional District elected Lewis McFadden in a landslide victory in all 4 counties. News of the victory brought celebration in Canton, including a parade and the firing off of rockets and Roman candles. 6 months later, in May of 1915, McFadden was well into his first term in Congress. World War I had begun in Europe in July of 1914, and President Woodrow Wilson was again following his foreign policy of watchful waiting, hoping to stay out of the conflict. McFadden spent the early years of his career attacking the Wilson administration after he found an overwhelming majority of Democrats in the House and a president who was unfriendly to his suggestions. As the war began, McFadden's old friend Elbert Hubbard published a great deal of commentary about the war and became anxious to cross the ocean, report on the war, and land an interview with the German Emperor Kaiser Wilhelm II. He obtained a passport and on May 1, 1915, left with his wife on a trip to Europe aboard the ship RMS Lusitania. This picture was taken just before they boarded the ship. The Cunard Line, owners of the Lusitania, warned passengers that it was dangerous to travel as a result of the war. Hubbard was convinced that the Germans would never be so low as to sink a passenger ship. On May 7, 1915, while at sea 11 miles from Ireland, the Lusitania was torpedoed and sunk by the German U-boat U-20. The bodies of Mr. and Mrs. Hubbard were never recovered, and it is believed they went down with the ship. The sinking of the Lusitania enraged the United States and the Allied countries in Europe. President Wilson continued his watchful waiting policies, and several more U.S. vessels were destroyed by the Germans. Finally, in April of 1917, the United States declared war on Germany. This poster was seen for the first time, and local men registered with their local board, including Lewis McFadden, and many were sent to fight. McFadden was excused from service because he was a member of Congress. The war ended with the signing of the armistice in November 1918. Lewis McFadden became president of the First National Bank of Canton at the beginning of 1916, and now that the war was over, he sought to grow the bank and grow his own personal investments in local businesses. The First National Bank reported its assets at the beginning of 1919 as $1.2 million, an astonishing number that year for a bank in a town the size of Canton. For years, the bank ran weekly advertisements in local newspapers urging local farmers and businessmen to open savings accounts and to conduct their financial business through the First National Bank. With McFadden as president, these advertisements only increased. In 1919, a 3-year-long feud between Congressman Louis T. McFadden and U.S. Comptroller of Currency John Skelton Williams came to a head. The Office of the Comptroller of the Currency is an independent bureau within the United States Department of the Treasury that serves to charter, regulate, and supervise all national banks. McFadden claimed that the feud began in 1914 when Williams, quote, "without just reason or cause, conceived an ever-increasing personal enmity, hatred, and malice against me," end quote. He said as time has gone on, it has increased in intensity and finally ripened into a determination on the part of Williams to bring about the financial and political ruin of McFadden for his own selfish and personal purposes. In February of 1919, McFadden introduced a bill in the House to abolish the office of Comptroller of Currency and followed this up with a resolution to investigate abuse of power by Williams. President Woodrow Wilson had appointed Carter Glass as the new Secretary of the Treasury at about the same time, replacing William McAdoo. Glass reappointed John Skelton Williams as Comptroller of Currency even though the Senate failed to confirm him. This enraged McFadden, who sent a strongly worded letter to Glass questioning the validity of the appointment. In response, Glass wrote to McFadden, quote, "I am returning your letter of March 14th, as I do not care to retain it for my files. Furthermore, I take leave to put you on notice that if you desire information concerning any official action of the Secretary of the Treasury while I am the incumbent of the office, you may get it promptly and frankly by addressing to me a halfway decent inquiry. But you are given distinctly to understand that I recognize no obligation to respond to an offensively impertinent and deliberately mendacious communication such as I am now sending back to you." End quote. In early April, bank examiners visited Canton to investigate the assets of the First National Bank. According to McFadden, the visit was well over a week in length, and during this time the examiners acted in an unusual manner while at the bank, and shared confidential information about the bank with its competitors, the Farmers National Bank, across the street. They demanded an accounting of the bank's assets, which McFadden refused to provide. The president of the rival Farmers National Bank, John A. Innes, used the presence of the bank examiners to his benefit by spreading information to the effect that people were drawing their deposits out of the First National Bank and depositing them in the Farmers National Bank. Innes then took the opportunity to increase his business by standing in front of the First National Bank for an entire day and soliciting depositors. McFadden claimed that the bank examiners had met with John Innes in their room at the Hotel Packard prior to this event. The visit of the bank examiners to Canton caused fear and apprehension in the community. Over $100,000 was withdrawn from the First National Bank, and 120 accounts were closed in a period of 1 month. Beginning in June of 1919, a month of hearings were held before the Senate Committee on Banking and Currency on the renomination of John Skelton Williams to be Comptroller of Currency. It was believed that this hearing would bring to light any wrongdoing that Williams might have engaged in, and McFadden claimed he was anxious to testify and share the evidence that proved his claims. McFadden attended a handful of these meetings. At the July 14th hearing, the chairman asked McFadden if he was ready to testify. McFadden said he was not ready, stating, quote, "The reason for that is, Mr. Chairman, that if I do start in, it would take some considerable time, and owing to the death of a relative, I am having to leave the city this afternoon, and I would prefer, if it is possible, to appear at a later date." End quote. I could not find any proof of his claim. Hearing after hearing went by, and at each hearing, John Skelton Williams asked where McFadden was, to which the chairman would respond that he had been notified of the meeting. McFadden finally showed up to another meeting, and Williams asked the chairman if McFadden could now testify. The chairman said no, and adjourned the meeting. McFadden never did do any more than provide a letter stating reasons he could not testify, which were contrary to what he had originally said. Williams was subsequently confirmed and served until 1921. This circumstance with Williams provides a glimpse at how McFadden would handle confrontation throughout the 20 years he was in Congress. He often made accusations against people which were very shocking or dramatic. He many times made these statements to newspapers or over the radio, which didn't allow anyone to be able to immediately respond. When it came down to proving his accusations, he was never available or claimed other reasons why he could not share his evidence. In 1920, McFadden was made chairman of the House Banking and Currency Committee, where he is best known for sponsoring the National Banking Act in 1927, known as the McFadden Act. The McFadden Act gave individual states the authority to govern bank branches located within the state. This included branches of national banks located within state lines. The act was intended to allow national banks to compete with state banks by permitting them to open branches within state limitations. As previously mentioned, McFadden had invested in several companies, some local and some in other states. However, one of his largest investments locally was in a factory located off West Union Street in Canton on what is now Clinton Street. McFadden was one of the incorporators of the Canton Couch Company, built in 1905 to manufacture and sell furniture. Over the next 16 years, the company would change names 6 times, as one by one each company owned by McFadden went bankrupt. Over that time, the company changed from producing furniture to producing phonographs. The Marr Oil Corporation of Arkansas was owned by a man named Pat Marr. Louis McFadden became a director of the corporation and later chairman of the board, a job he held up to August 30th, 1923. Another director of this corporation was named Arthur Rottenberg. In August of 1923, Pat Marr told Rottenberg that he would like to sell his corporation. So Rottenberg went to see McFadden in Washington, D.C. to get the congressman to go to New York and negotiate with a reliable oil company for the sale of the property. Rottenberg and McFadden tried to make a deal with the Southern States Oil Corporation through its president, former Democratic Congressman Scott Ferris. Ferris said that Southern States Oil would not pay cash for Marr Oil Company, but would exchange its stock for the Marr Company. Rottenberg objected to the proposal. Ferris responded by saying that if his offer was accepted, Southern States Oil would give McFadden and Rottenberg $100,000 and an additional amount of 10,000 shares of Southern States stock under the table. So McFadden went to Pat Marr and persuaded him to accept the deal, saying that he had known Ferris in Congress and that the man was absolutely honest. Pat Marr sold his company, and when McFadden and Rottenberg appeared for the bribe, Ferris said he did not have $100,000, but would instead give them $50,000. The two men took the money and divided it between themselves, along with 7,039 shares, not 10,000 shares, as had been promised. McFadden was president of the First National Bank at the time, and borrowed money from the bank using only his Southern States Oil stock as collateral to help fund his business in Canton. Pat Marr was eventually sent to prison for engaging in fraud through the United States mail. He discovered that he had been double-crossed by McFadden and Rottenberg, and upon release from jail sued them for the return of his company. During the trial, Rottenberg was the first witness to testify, after which he was excused with the direction of the court to return for further cross-examination. However, before he could return to court, he jumped out of the 4th-floor window at the Biltmore Hotel in an apparent attempt to commit suicide. He was confined to the hospital for several months, with fractures of both ankles, fracture dislocations of both knees and the right shoulder, and a fracture at the base of the skull. He was in plaster casts for weeks and when he regained consciousness, he was mentally and emotionally unstable. McFadden was out of the jurisdiction of the court, so he avoided testifying in the case. In a decision rendered in this case on March 24, 1931, Judge Benjamin Cardozo said, quote, Rottenberg and McFadden were parties to a fraudulent conspiracy, end quote. The New York World newspaper called this a, quote, seal of disapproval upon McFadden's business conduct, end quote. McFadden testified one time before a committee in the House that dealt with radio matters, stating, quote, my interest in the subject of radio broadcasting is of long standing. I think I can say without any reservation that I probably had the first radio receiving set that was in Washington, and it was manufactured in a plant which I owned personally. I have been observing for a long time the development of radio broadcasting in the United States, and have been very much interested at all times to see that this modern development proceeded without hindrance and without undue censorship. I recognized early the great power and influence that it would have in the dissemination of information. I realized as a news distributing agency that it had powers equal to that of the press, if not greater. End quote. McFadden frequently used radio to broadcast his opinion on government matters. In February of 1925, the Federated Radio Corporation was formed upon the consolidation of 5 companies, with Louis T. McFadden as president. The corporation sought permission to sell $1.3 million in Federated Radio stock. McFadden stated that, quote, Federated Radio Corporation common stock offers a diversification of interest in the radio industry not otherwise conveniently obtainable, end quote. His brokerage firm ran advertisements around the country to attract people who were interested in buying stock in the corporation. In May of 1925, Louis T. McFadden and the brokerage firms of Canton, Green and Company and E.W. Klukas and Company were sued by William Rosenblatt on charges of fraud. Rosenblatt claimed that the corporation's claims of having large assets and earning powers was, quote, false and fraudulent, end quote. The suit ended with an injunction order signed by Supreme Court Justice Carswell of Brooklyn, restraining the brokerage houses from doing any further business with the company. On January 14, 1926, it was announced that the stockholders of the First National Bank of Canton held their annual meeting and re-elected Louis T. McFadden as one of their directors. But for the first time in 10 years, McFadden was not elected president, but was replaced by C.E. Bullock. According to an ad published in the Sayre Evening Times several years later, the directors of the First National Bank had to dig deeply into their own pockets to save the bank after McFadden lost so much of the depositors' money on his own personal investments. On March 30th, McFadden filed a petition for bankruptcy in Canton, and in that petition he placed the value of the Federated Radio Corporation stock at $60,000, far less than previously stated. Despite his bankruptcy, McFadden had ensured that he would never lose Moreland Park. Shortly after he purchased the property years ago, he had deeded the property to his wife. With the house in Helen's name, a bankruptcy involving Louis McFadden's business investments would never cause them to lose all their assets. As a member of the U.S. House of Representatives, Louis McFadden was up for re-election every 2 years on even-numbered years for what had now become the 15th Congressional District. When 1928 rolled around, it seemed that this would be just another election. McFadden, after all, had run essentially unopposed for 7 elections. This year, however, not only would another Republican be running against him in the spring primaries, his opponent would be a woman. The first woman had been elected to Congress in 1916, but Pennsylvania wouldn't elect a woman to Congress until 1942, so it was unusual that a woman was challenging McFadden. The woman who would run against McFadden in 1928 was Cornelia Pinchot, wife of former Pennsylvania Governor and the father of American forestry Gifford Pinchot. The Pinchot's home, Gray Towers, was in Milford, Pennsylvania, located in Pike County, and was now part of the 15th Congressional District. Today, it is a National Historic Site. Gifford Pinchot had been first Chief of the United States Forest Service under Theodore Roosevelt's administration. Pinchot and Roosevelt became close friends. In 1914, at the age of 49, Pinchot married Cornelia Bryce, a wealthy woman in her early 30s. Theodore Roosevelt attended the wedding. Cornelia had already begun an independent political life as a champion of the working woman and an advocate of women's suffrage. Roosevelt considered her to have one of the best political minds he had ever known. Cornelia Pinchot was a tough woman, a trait that would be necessary if she was to win against McFadden. On Monday, April 9, 1928, Mrs. Pinchot arrived in Canton and addressed the employees of the Belmar Manufacturing Company and the Liberty Greeting Card Plant. These businesses were owned by Louis Marble, who was interested in removing McFadden from office. During her visit, she reviewed the issues and dispelled some myths, namely, that her hair had been dyed and that she had a glass eye. Mrs. Pinchot had red hair, and during this election, McFadden supporters had been referring to her in a derogatory manner as the red-haired woman. They considered red hair to be a sign that a person had a fiery or hot temper or was a moral degenerate, and thus not fit for election to Congress. They also openly asserted that her hair was actually black, and that she had dyed it red. The country was at this time in the midst of Prohibition. As the congressional candidate, you were either wet or dry, depending on whether you thought alcohol should be legalized. Both McFadden and Pinchot were dry candidates, but McFadden's supporters did their best to try and convince the public that Pinchot was a wet candidate, even going as far as saying that McFadden was the Anti-Saloon League's choice over Pinchot, a statement that was proven false by the League itself. Cornelia was scheduled to return to Canton on Thursday, April 12th, where she was expected to speak at the Crawford Theater at 4:35 p.m. While on her way to Canton, she stopped several times in small communities to speak. The Canton Sentinel reports, quote, "When Mrs. Pinchot started on her itinerary on Thursday, April 12th, the McFadden automobile trailed her, and whenever she stopped at a crossroads or a schoolhouse to speak, the McFadden automobile was there. The McFadden automobile drove into Canton about 6 minutes ahead of her, and Mr. McFadden climbed out and entered the crowded theater and forced his way down front and was courteously given a seat. When the lady began to speak, he fidgeted visibly, and after several preliminary interruptions, he is said to have asked her if she smoked. She replied, 'No, sir,' with perfect candor and courtesy. And he followed this up with the question, 'Mrs. Pinchot, do you drink?' Again she replied, 'No, sir.' At this point came the cries as variously reported, 'Put him out! Make him sit down!' Mr. McFadden is then said to have asked, 'Mrs. Pinchot, do you dare to stand there and say that you do not drink?' There was so much confusion at this time that no two people report exactly the same thing. She is said to have replied, quote, 'No, let him remain. I do not drink, and he knows it. If elected, I will live dry and vote dry, and give all my patronage to dry people.' End quote. Before and after this episode, Mr. McFadden interrupted the speaker several times with questions about as relevant to the matter under discussion as these quoted, and was always answered with ladylike courtesy, while Mr. McFadden himself showed signs of being slightly, to put it mildly, flustered. The meeting broke up peaceably, thanks to Mrs. Pinchot, and Mr. McFadden marched out. At the door, he encountered a group of young businessmen and attempted a handshaking campaign, when the men put their hands in their pockets. A very cautious thing to do here in Canton." End quote. The Associated Press picked up the story about the events that took place in the Crawford Theater in Canton, Pennsylvania, and the story ran in newspapers across the United States. A news story in the Oakland, California newspaper announced Mrs. Gifford Pinchot heckled by political foe at meeting. The primary election was held on April 25, 1928. The election resulted in a win for Louis T. McFadden. McFadden carried the counties of Bradford, Sullivan, Wyoming, and Wayne, while Pinchot carried her own county of Pike. In Canton, however, McFadden's hometown, Cornelia Pinchot won with 96 votes in her favor compared to McFadden's 33. This was perhaps an indication of a slight rift that was developing among what had been loyal McFadden supporters years ago. McFadden earned both the Republican and Democratic nomination and sailed through the fall election, earning yet another term in Congress. But something else had happened in the fall election. The United States elected Republican Herbert Hoover as the next president by a substantial majority. This trend was reflected in Canton, Alba, and LeRoy, where Hoover earned several hundred votes. Hoover began his term as president in 1929 on a promise to continue the prosperity of the 1920s. Throughout the 1920s, stock prices continued to rise, and people were becoming wealthy. Investors were beginning to believe that this trend was permanent, but the American economy was showing signs of trouble. On March 25th, a mini stock market crash occurred after investors started to sell stocks at a rapid pace. The financial crisis was averted, but not for long. Steel production was declining, construction was sluggish, car sales were down, and consumers were building up high debts because of easy credit. Banks were speculating in the stock market using depositors' money. On October 29, 1929, Black Tuesday hit Wall Street as investors traded millions of shares on the New York Stock Exchange in a single day. Billions of dollars were lost, wiping out thousands of investors. In the aftermath of Black Tuesday, America and the rest of the industrialized world spiraled downward into the Great Depression, the deepest and longest-lasting economic downturn in the history of the Western industrialized world. Louis McFadden had warned Congress of this impending financial crisis repeatedly as chairman of the House Banking and Currency Committee. Through much of the following year, McFadden continued to speak on the floor of the House on financial matters related to the Federal Reserve and international finance. The Great Depression had begun in the United States, and during 1930 and early 1931, this economic depression would spread to nations around the world. Soon, a banking crisis struck Europe, with bank runs in Germany. Britain made the decision to go off the gold standard due to the crisis. These European countries were still in debt to the United States as a result of World War I. The American government and private investors had loaned these countries millions of dollars to assist in the rebuilding of Europe, and had been receiving payments from them ever since. But now, due to the Depression, these governments were not able to continue making payments. They were asking for additional time for recovery. On June 20th, 1931, President Hoover issued a public statement to be known as the Hoover Moratorium. His proposition was to put a one-year moratorium or delay on payments of World War I and other war debt. This statement was made while Congress was not in session. By July, 15 nations were in support of the idea, but many U.S. citizens disapproved, including Congress, and among them, Louis McFadden. On August 26, during a picnic held for supporters at Moreland Park east of Canton, McFadden in a speech said that Hoover needs every Republican's support. And yet, on October 30th, before the Kiwanis Club of Williamsport, McFadden criticized the State Department and the Treasury Department and predicted disaster if the country's methods of dealing with Europe did not change. McFadden was by now outraged with the idea of the Hoover Moratorium. In November, during a speech before the Institute of Current International Problems of the United States, given in Boston, McFadden said that European war debts should neither be canceled nor reduced, that the Hoover administration was a menace to the welfare of its own people, and that the United States should return to our ancient tradition of no European alliances. On December 7th, the Associated Press reported that McFadden had lost his position as chairman of the Banking and Currency Committee. The same day, New York Times readers found in their newspapers an article written by Adolf Hitler and sent from Berlin. In the article, Hitler wrote, quote, "America is daily turning more from an observer into a sufferer in the European drama." End quote. He goes on to say, "As a matter of fact, the United States has already started to express an opinion on the present situation. I refer to the statements of Senator William E. Borah and Congressman Louis T. McFadden. There you have genuine Americanism asserting itself in plain, everyday language. Just days later, the Hoover administration decided to permit postponement of foreign debt payments totaling $125 million, which were due that week pending action by Congress on the moratorium. During debate in Congress on the moratorium, McFadden was given 1 hour to speak. He said that the president had acted without any legal or official authority for the benefit of a country with which we had been at war and brought about an enormous financial loss to the United States. McFadden stated that Hoover's proposal caused money to be taken away from the citizens of the United States and given to Germany. This, in my opinion, he said, was an infamous proposal. Quote, I have been here for a good many years. For the past 17 years, I've been a member of the House Banking and Currency Committee. For that reason, I presume, I received a telegram last June from the President of the United States asking my consent to the course he wished to pursue. I did not answer that telegram. I am standing here as the representative of the 15th Congressional District of my native state, and my vote has not been cast in secret upon a matter concerning which my constituents have had no information and no chance for discussion. This is the place we make the laws. This is the place where my vote is cast for the 15th District of Pennsylvania. This was followed by applause. I do not vote on matters concerning the welfare of the United States in a telephone booth or the office of a telegraph company. Consequently, I stand here free. I have made no bargain to vote for the proposal of the German international bankers and the deal Herbert Hoover is trying to put through for them. End quote. And then McFadden made a statement about Herbert Hoover that caused chaos in the House. McFadden said, quote, he proposed to sell us out to Germany. End quote. Representative O'Connor, a Democrat of New York, demanded that some Republican, quote, should defend the president from charges which are grounds for impeachment, end quote. Representative Chipperfield, a Republican of Illinois, leaped up and answered McFadden. He was a new member of the House, and this was his first speech. Quote, I denounce as false and untrue any statement that the president has negotiated directly with German financial interests. I denounce the statement that the president is the agent of any interest adverse to the people of the United States. If there is one particle of integrity in the statement the gentleman McFadden has made, let the gentleman produce proof of his charges. Let him show that we have a president who is unworthy of occupying that high office, or let him go from this chamber as a foul traducer of the character of an honest man. If the gentleman is sincere, let him and his associates prepare articles of impeachment against the president, and let those articles of impeachment be tried, and then the truth may be known, and let the guilt and infamy and horror fall where it is due. End quote. McFadden made no answer. He declined any further statement except that he would testify before the House Ways and Means Committee on the debt plan. The Oshkosh Daily Northwestern newspaper of Wisconsin reported, quote, not since the time of Andrew Johnson has a member of the party of the president stood on the floor of the House or the Senate and subjected the country's president to such a severe arraignment and denunciation as Congressman McFadden did President Hoover. End quote. The next day, Beatty of Maine accused McFadden of uttering falsehoods, to which both parties stood and applauded. Republican leader, Representative Snell, told President Hoover that Representative Beatty had, quote, taken the hide off him, end quote. 25 of McFadden's fellow Pennsylvanians adopted a resolution declaring complete confidence in the president. The same day, Senators Reed and Davis of Pennsylvania requested that Postmaster General Brown deprive McFadden's patronage privilege of naming postmasters in his district. Brown agreed. Senator Reed said, quote, we intend to act to all practical purposes as though Representative McFadden has died, end quote. In the House, a move was made by Representative Darrow to compel McFadden to prove his assertions or be read out of the party. Representative Darrow said, quote, an opportunity should be given to McFadden, and he could be made to prove his charges. If he cannot, he should recant or suffer the consequences. Representative Snell said, "All Republicans are awfully mad" at McFadden, but refused to discuss further plans to punish him. McFadden said he was prepared to furnish proof of his allegations and would when given the opportunity. The New York Times picked up a story run by the Canton Sentinel in which leading citizens of Canton were interviewed as to what they thought about McFadden calling the Hoover moratorium infamous. Charles A. Innes, president of the First National Bank, of which Mr. McFadden was formerly head, said, quote, "I believe President Hoover is honest and sincere," end quote. Dr. James W. Parsons, retired physician, said, quote, "Mr. McFadden is outrageous. President Hoover is courageous," end quote. Rufus G. Brown, Civil War veteran and past commander of Ingham Post 91 GAR, said, quote, "I don't like to hear anyone insulting our president. It has always been unpatriotic and un-American," end quote. William J. McIntosh, past commander of the American Legion Post 333 of Pennsylvania, said, quote, "I think Congressman McFadden was out of order in attacking President Hoover. No one should ever do that," end quote. Gustavus F. Kreis, the mayor, said, quote, "I believe the president is sincere and right," end quote. C. Arthur Bullock, secretary of the Chamber of Commerce, said, quote, "It should be required that the alleged accusations by Congressman McFadden against President Hoover be proved," end quote. Barry C. Gates, cashier of the Farmers National Bank, said, quote, "I believe that Mr. McFadden's attack on the president was unwarranted and unjustified, and I do not believe that it is meeting with the approval of local voters," end quote. The article goes on to say, quote, "Today's issue of the Canton Sentinel says that Mr. McFadden is either a Lincoln or a Judas Iscariot, and asks for proof of his assertions. Talk on the street, in the stores, and other places indicate that the people of Canton believe that Mr. McFadden has overstepped the mark this time. Many of his friends and associates have been interviewed, and almost without exception they agreed that his attack was unwise and entirely without reason," end quote. Norman W. Lyon of Wyalusing wrote a letter to the editor of the New York Times saying, quote, "Out here, in Representative McFadden's home district, we are still quite speechless, from disgust or pride or mere surprise. Some of us find reason to believe that our little Napoleon has ambitions to head a right-wing Hitlerite movement in the United States," end quote. McFadden continued to fight and proposed an investigation by the Banking Committee into activities of the Federal Reserve System, its relations to foreign banks, and capital and open market operations. Late in the evening on December 18th, the House approved the Hoover moratorium. Although denounced from the floor, McFadden returned in the late hours of the debate and offered to prove his charges against President Hoover. The Daily News of Huntington, PA, reported at that point the House was thrown into turmoil. Representative Free of California, a friend of President Hoover, jumped to his feet and announced he would read a New York Court of Appeals decision blaming McFadden for alleged fraudulent practices in a stock transaction. Several members who knew of the decision jumped to their feet. Confusion prevailed. Representative Blanton, Democrat of Texas, demanded that the stenographer take down Free's words, as this might lead to a reprimand by the House. Representative Crisp, Democrat of Georgia, suggested that both men withdraw the remarks and proposals. This was done, and the incident was dropped. Representative Martin Dies of Texas then shouted, quote, "We've been saving Europe for 12 years. Why don't we save America? I'm a selfish American and I admit it. Go home and read Washington's farewell address after you pass this bill," end quote. Representative Percy Quinn, Democrat of Mississippi, loosened his collar and said, "They talk about bankruptcies in Europe. We've got plenty of them in our country," end quote. The House then passed the moratorium by a vote of 317 to 100. It included a rider that opposed any revision or cancellation of war debts, which McFadden considered a victory. Next, it went to the Senate. The Daily Review of Towanda, a strong supporter of McFadden, interviewed him by phone at the end of the week. He was tired and worn out, yet he promised the folks back home a thorough explanation of his actions within a few days. The Daily Review asked him, Quote, "Were you correctly quoted in saying that President Hoover proposes to sell us out?" "No, I was not," he stated emphatically. "Ambitious newspaper men trying to make a sensational story took my words literally, whereas I meant them purely figuratively. My claim is that the administration's attitude has amounted to that." End quote. In an editorial by Daily Review editor Hewlett M. Turner, he said that McFadden may have used a poor choice of words in his speech, but never with intent to question the honor and integrity of President Hoover. On December 21st, the Daily Review reported that punitive measures against McFadden had become harsher than ever. Quote, "I am being shadowed in every move I make," he declared. "Even my friends are being watched." End quote. He said it was reported in Washington that Senator Reed had instigated this disagreeable feature, but that he, of course, had no definite knowledge to that effect. Quote, "When his attention was called to the declaration of Senator Reed that he hopes to defeat the congressman when he comes up for re-election next spring, Mr. McFadden only laughed. 'I'm not interested in that. I'm interested only in the fight here now,' he said, 'and I won't be swerved from it one iota.' Mr. McFadden said further information will be forthcoming by mail, but he hesitated to say more over the phone, saying probably someone is listening in. He indicated it is difficult to say how far the attack on him will be carried." End quote. Tired of Republicans, Representative John E. Rankin, Democrat of Mississippi, served notice on the House Republicans that if they didn't stop airing their dirty laundry in the House, he would ask investigation of Representative McFadden's charges against the president on the moratorium. Meanwhile, the administration had taken no formal notice of McFadden's attack on the president except to leave McFadden out of a recent White House breakfast conference of House Banking Committee members. Newspapers made fun of the whole situation by running this political cartoon December 21st, showing McFadden throwing snowballs at President Hoover while the Republican regulars paddled him. News came on December 22nd that the Senate had just approved the moratorium. The next day, it was signed by Hoover. Back home in Canton, Lewis Marble, president of the Belmar Manufacturing Company, and Fred Newell, editor of the Canton Sentinel, were fed up with McFadden. Each man sent telegrams in December 1931 to Cornelia Pinchot in an effort to convince her to run a second time against McFadden in the 1932 primaries. Marble's telegram said, quote, "With McFadden discredited and despised on account of his charges against President Hoover, I call on you to announce yourself at once as a candidate for Congress in the coming primaries." End quote. Newell's telegram said, quote, "Believe Canton and Bradford County have had enough of McFadden. Hope you will be our next representative in Congress and urge your immediate announcement." End quote. Gifford Pinchot had been re-elected to a new term as Pennsylvania governor. Even so, Cornelia decided to run in the upcoming primary. "If I am elected," she said, "I pledge myself to initiate and push measures promoting the welfare of agriculture, manufacturing, mining, and other industries and interests of the district, and to work unceasingly for such legislation as will lift the burden of taxation from the shoulders of those who are least able to bear it." In January 1932, 112 Republican friends of Mrs. Pinchot met at the courthouse in Towanda and organized their campaign team. L.M. Marble was chosen temporary chairman and appointed an organization committee that divided the county into 4 districts: East, West, North Central, and South Central. Fred Newell was chosen chairman of the county, and regional chairmen were elected for each district. By early February, Cornelia Pinchot and a man named Frederick G. Reichenbacher of Honesdale had formally filed petitions to run for office. McFadden was in western Pennsylvania, considering a run for senator against James J. Davis. The news then came that petitions were being circulated in North Dakota to have McFadden entered in the North Dakota Republican presidential primary, but his backers soon changed their mind. When neither a Senate campaign nor a presidential campaign worked out, McFadden returned to his district and announced his candidacy for Congress, which appeared first on April 20th in what the Canton Sentinel called the McFadden-supported Daily Review. In his campaign announcement, McFadden stated that he believed the United States was on its way to economic recovery when the Hoover moratorium was proposed. This statement was a signal that McFadden would continue to fight Hoover if reelected. The Canton Sentinel pointed out that, quote, his formal announcement bristles with I ams, but there is no reference to anything he proposes to do for our 15th district, and no reference to anything he has done. The announcement has plenty about gold and millions, but not one word about farms and roads. Gold and millions has always been his work, and his talk, but farms, roads, and other agricultural interests have not been his interests. Our chief objection to him politically is his steadfast disinterest in agricultural affairs while representing an agricultural district. Money, bonds, gold, silver, banks, currency, securities, finances, and incomes have kept his attention while farms, roads, and other local interests have been dealt with by congressmen other than our own. End quote. The eyes of the nation are focused on us, wondering whether we are going to support a man who openly insulted the President of the United States. End quote. While the Canton Sentinel, with Fred Newell as editor, expounded on the need to elect Cornelia Pinchot, the Daily Review of Towanda, with Hewlett M. Turner as editor, expounded on the wonderful qualities of Louis McFadden. In two separate newspapers, the Daily Review ran letters of support from across the nation that had been received by McFadden. For instance, this one from Rochester, New York businessman said, quote, I would like to shake hands with you and thank you for having real American blood in your system. If we had more like you in Congress, we could live as we should. End quote. The Daily Review also published a letter from the Capitol Searchlight of Washington, D.C., quote, to Pennsylvanians of the 15th District, we want to say the people of the United States look to you, depend on you, to uphold the hands of this faithful public servant. His re-election is more important now than anything you can do. End quote. On Saturday, April 2, 1932, Cornelia Pinchot arrived in Bradford County for 5 speaking engagements at West Franklin, LeRoy, Alba, Burlington, and Towanda. At 1 p.m., she spoke at the store of E.A. Holcomb & Son at LeRoy, followed by a speech at the Alba Hotel at 2:15 p.m. The Canton Sentinel reported that she was enthusiastically received at all points. As the days passed, Louis McFadden and Cornelia Pinchot traveled far and wide across the 15th Congressional District and ran a profusion of political ads. Late in April, an appearance by McFadden in the main square of Canton attracted over 1,000 people with flags waving and political signs stating, America First, McFadden for Congress, and Our Fad is McFadden. The speaker's platform was a flatbed truck. After a speech given by McFadden, people thronged the platform to shake hands with McFadden and discuss the issues. Some remarked that it was one of the best political meetings ever held in Canton. The following evening, a meeting was held at the Bradford County Courthouse at 8 p.m., with McFadden and others expected to speak. Again, the courthouse was filled to capacity, and the Daily Review reported that there were hundreds who couldn't get inside and hundreds who weren't even in hearing distance. Finally, it was April 26th, Election Day. McFadden and Pinchot had previously returned to their homes to await the results of the election. At Moreland Park, the McFaddens hosted over 300 people who enjoyed a buffet luncheon as the election returns came in. Even before the evening had ended, it was clear that McFadden was the winner, surpassing Pinchot by approximately 2,200 votes in Bradford County alone, and carrying Canton, LeRoy, Alba, and other nearby towns. He also won on both Republican and Democratic tickets. McFadden had won re-election against great odds, and without the support of the state Republican organization. On April 28th, he appeared on the floor of the House for the first time since the election. Despite what some congressmen may have thought of him, they had to respect the fact that he had won re-election. As soon as he was noticed, there was a sudden outburst as House members applauded and cheered, and people in the galleries joined in. The applause lasted for more than 3 minutes. The Democrats swarmed around McFadden and swept him to their side, where everyone shook his hand. Next, the Republicans congratulated him. He finally made it to his seat and proceedings continued for the day. The next day, McFadden returned home to Moorland Park, and that evening a group of 30 residents from LeRoy visited the McFadden home to enjoy refreshments and congratulate him on his victory. McFadden said that he owed his nomination and certain election to his enemies. In June 1932, McFadden wrote a 10-page letter to Senator David A. Reed, demanding that the senator return to him the patronage generally accorded to congressmen of the same political faith as the president. Reed responded by saying that patronage is extended to political friends of the administration and not, quote, Democrats and other political adversaries, end quote. During the past election campaign, it was said that McFadden would get his patronage back if he was reelected. This confirmed McFadden's suspicion that this was not true. The next day, June 10, 1932, the House was debating a bill relating to the Federal Reserve. In the past, McFadden had spoke many times about the Federal Reserve, which had been established just before McFadden entered Congress. But today, he would do something unprecedented. He spoke for 25 minutes, and the words he would say are still quoted by conspiracy theorists today. The most important statement from his speech is this, quote, Mr. Chairman, we have in this country one of the most corrupt institutions the world has ever known. I refer to the Federal Reserve Board and the Federal Reserve Banks. The Federal Reserve Board, a government board, has cheated the government of the United States out of enough money to pay the national debt. The depredations and iniquities of the Federal Reserve Board and the Federal Reserve Bank acting together have cost this country enough money to pay the national debt several times over. This evil institution has impoverished and ruined the people of the United States, has bankrupted itself, and has practically bankrupted our government. It has done this through defects of the law under which it operates, through the maladministration of that law by the Federal Reserve Board, and through the corrupt practices of the moneyed vultures who control it, end quote. In his speech, McFadden makes the point that he believed the Federal Reserve had caused the Depression. In the coming months, McFadden renewed his attack on the Hoover administration. Hoover as well as McFadden were up for re-election in November, and Republicans were finding it difficult to vote for both men. When the election results came in, however, McFadden had won, while Herbert Hoover had lost. In fact, the Canton Sentinel reported Hoover was the worst beaten president since William H. Taft was beaten by Woodrow Wilson in 1912. While the majority of Canton, Troy, and Granville residents voted for Hoover, the remainder of Bradford County did not. The presidency would go to New York Governor Franklin Delano Roosevelt. But McFadden wasn't done with Herbert Hoover. On December 13, 1932, while the House of Representatives was in session, a 25-year-old Sears Roebuck department store worker named Martin Kemmerer of Allentown, Pennsylvania, was watching the proceedings of the House from the public gallery above the House floor. At 4 p.m., he rose from his seat, waved a .38 caliber revolver, and shouted, quote, I want the floor for a few minutes, end quote. There was sudden panic as House members ran for cover. Representative Moss, Republican of Minnesota, walked over to a spot directly under Kemmerer. I want the floor, said Kemmerer. All right, son, said Moss, but before you get the floor, you just give me the gun. Kemmerer dropped the gun and was seized by police. Kemmerer claimed he wanted to address the House about the relief of the unemployed and the Depression in general. In his suit pocket was a slip of paper with the opening paragraph of his intended speech. Quote, Okay, America, for the next 20 minutes you will listen to a speech which has the interest of the American people. The first man that tries to stop me will die. Is that understood? End quote. Authorities later found 2 sticks of dynamite in his hotel room and discovered that he was originally intending to blow himself up after delivering the speech. The same day, the House had been considering routine appropriations, and it was an otherwise slow afternoon. Louis McFadden had chosen this day to punish Herbert Hoover. He walked down the center aisle and addressed the chair. Quote, Mr. Speaker, I rise to a question of constitutional privilege. On my own responsibility as a member of the House of Representatives, I impeach Herbert Hoover, President of the United States, for high crimes and misdemeanors. End quote. The clerk then read the 4,000-word resolution containing 26 whereases. This was only the second time in American history that anyone had impeached the president on the House floor. The Democratic leaders hurried down and gathered around Speaker Garner's seat, while Republicans gathered around their speaker, Representative Snell. As the clerk finished, McFadden seated himself without another word. Representative Poe, Democrat of North Carolina, motioned that the resolution be tabled. The chamber voted 361 to 8 to table his motion for impeachment proceedings. McFadden was the only Republican voting in favor of the motion. Congressman Snell of New York characterized the congressional vote as the most severe spanking that could be administered to a grown man. Immediately after this action, the Pennsylvania Republican delegation met and voted to request McFadden's resignation as its secretary. McFadden did not reply, and so the delegation met again and voted to oust him. There was also talk of possibly ousting him from his position on the Banking and Currency Committee in the next term. The repeated punishments from the Republican Party didn't seem to faze McFadden, and on January 17, 1933, he again tried to impeach Hoover. Representative H.T. Rainey, Democrat of Illinois, motioned to table the resolution, and the House voted 342 to 11 to table. The Canton Sentinel reported, quote, "Something is wrong. Mr. McFadden is making accusations which should either be proven or disproved. As the matter stands, Mr. McFadden is in the bad graces of everyone who might be in a position to be of help to his district. If he is correct, then his district is being badly treated. If he is wrong, then we are being badly represented." End quote. January 18th, McFadden tried again to speak on his resolution, but Speaker Garner refused to let him speak. "I insist that I am within my constitutional right to communicate a statement to the House," McFadden said. Finally, he gave up. Hoover's presidential term was within a month of ending. The Bluefield Daily Telegraph newspaper in West Virginia reported, quote, "The time grows short, and if Louis McFadden doesn't show more speed, Mr. Hoover is likely to leave office of his own free will." End quote. And that's exactly what happened. On March 4, 1933, change came to Washington in the form of the country's new president, Franklin D. Roosevelt. Roosevelt had been elected at the depths of the Depression, and in his first 100 days he spearheaded major legislation and issued executive orders that instituted the New Deal, a variety of programs designed to produce relief, recovery, and reform. On May 18th, during a meeting of the Bradford County Republican Committee, McFadden spoke against the New Deal, just over 2 weeks before the effects of the New Deal were to appear in his hometown of Canton. On June 5th, a train rolled into Lakeland, just over the mountain from Moreland Park, and unloaded a group of young men from the newly established Civilian Conservation Corps, one of Roosevelt's New Deal initiatives. The CCC camp at Lakeland would be instrumental in the cleanup and preservation of Barclay Mountain after the lumber boom was over. McFadden attacked the Democratic Roosevelt administration for its implementation of the New Deal just as hard as he has attacked the Hoover administration because of the moratorium. McFadden also told the Bradford County Republican Committee that, quote, "tremendous sums are being withheld by rich men in taxes," end quote. He had recently charged certain wealthy individuals with tax cheating, one of them being Andrew W. Mellon, one of the nation's richest men, and for 11 years Secretary of the Treasury. An investigation of Mellon soon followed. He next called for the impeachment of the entire Federal Reserve Board. The year 1933 signaled a change in Louis McFadden that seemed to parallel a change in Europe. On January 30th, Adolf Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany. In March, Nazi concentration camps were started for opponents of the regime or those who were viewed as a threat to the Nazis. The same month, 3 resolutions were introduced in the U.S. House to authorize the State Department to protest formally to Germany against attacks on United States citizens of Jewish origin who were living in Germany. Representative O'Connor of New York asked for unanimous consent to insert in the congressional record 2 resolutions that had been adopted in New York several days earlier. After discussion, the vote was taken and Louis McFadden surprised the House members by objecting. This killed any chance of inserting the resolution and derailed the protest against Germany's treatment of Jewish American citizens. Whether McFadden had carried anti-Semitic feelings prior to 1933 is not known, but he would soon prove that he had these feelings now. In a speech on the House floor on May 29th, he said, quote, "Is it not true that in the United States today the Gentiles have the slips of paper while the Jews have the gold and lawful money?" End quote. In the same speech, he demanded that the gold in the Federal Reserve banks be placed in the United States Treasury and that an audit of the United States government financial affairs be conducted from top to bottom. It appears that McFadden was beginning to connect what he referred to as the, quote, corrupt Federal Reserve with the Jews. On June 15th, he made an even more shocking speech stating, quote, "Mr. Speaker, there is no real persecution of the Jews in Germany, but there has been a pretended persecution of them because there are 200,000 unwanted communistic Jews in Germany, largely Galatian Jews, who entered Germany after the World War. And Germany is very anxious to get rid of those particular communistic Jews. The Germans wish to preserve the purity of their own blonde racial stock. They are willing to keep rich Jews like Max Warburg and Franz Mendelssohn, whose families have lived in Germany so long that they have acquired some German national characteristics. But the Germans are not willing to keep the Galatian Jews, the upstarts. So a great show is put on, largely by German Jews themselves, in the hope that Uncle Sam will prove himself to be as foolish as he was before, and that we will allow those Galatian and communistic Jews to come in here. When the so-called anti-Semitic campaign designed for American consumption was launched in Germany, France was alarmed because she feared the Galatian Jews might be dumped on French soil. French newspapers published articles concerning the menace. But now that France has been shown that the purpose of the anti-Semitic campaign is to dump the 200,000 communistic Jews on the United States, she is worried no longer. "Ah," she says, "Uncle Sam, he is to be the goat." Very good. Mr. Speaker, I regard it as a pity that there are Americans who love to fawn upon the money Jews and to flatter them. Some of these unfortunates are under obligation to the Jewish money changers and dare not cross them. We would be very foolish to allow Germany to dump her unwanted Jewish population on the United States." End quote. McFadden despised Roosevelt for ordering Americans to turn in their gold to the government in exchange for dollars and subsequently taking the U.S. off the gold standard. As a result, he called the Roosevelt administration a Jewish-controlled administration. He said, quote, "You have witnessed the unlawful seizure by Franklin D. Roosevelt of gold reserves and other valuables belonging to the people of the United States, the destruction of banks, the attempted whitewashing of the Federal Reserve Board and Federal Reserve banks, the corruption of which he admitted in his campaign harangues. And you may have noticed that what was confiscated is not in the hands of the present constitutional government, but in the hands of the international bankers, who are the nucleus of the new government Roosevelt is seeking to establish here. Roosevelt's actions are not in accordance with the Constitution of the United States." End quote. By 1934, Jewish American citizens had become concerned about McFadden's constant attacks on the House floor and through radio. In April, Alexander Bryn, a Jewish newspaper publisher, made a complaint to U.S. Attorney Francis J.W. Ford, stating that copies of the speech by Congressman McFadden attacking Jews had been sent through the mail in franked envelopes bearing McFadden's name. A franked envelope bears a mark and/or signature of a congressman, which allows him to send mail containing government business without paying postage. Alexander Bryn delivered to Attorney Ford a quantity of anti-Semitic literature that had been mailed out. McFadden insisted that he had not misused his franking privileges, as the material sent out was simply a speech made from the House floor. The Gentiles have slips of paper speech. At the same time, Representative Samuel Dickstein had introduced a resolution calling for the formation of a special committee to probe un-American activities in the United States. The Dickstein resolution passed, and Representative McCormick was named chairman of the committee with Dickstein as vice president. They began by investigating Nazi and other foreign propaganda in the United States. The interesting thing about Representative Dickstein is that 3 years later, he would begin engaging in espionage, selling U.S. government secrets to the Soviets, including information gathered through this committee. By then, the committee would be known as the House Un-American Activities Committee. Proof of a connection between McFadden and Nazi secret agents was published by investigative journalist and muckraker John L. Spivak in The New Masses, an American Marxist magazine that was closely associated with the Communist Party. Spivak had obtained a goldmine of documentation from his colleague Frank Prince, an investigator of anti-Semitic activities. We will deal with Spivak in a moment. One piece of evidence was a letter written by McFadden's secretary Jane C. Bittner to Royal Scott Golden and gives instructions pertaining to the franked McFadden speeches that were being sent to Golden for remailing through his channels. Royal Scott Golden was the head of an organization titled the Order of 76, a fascist and anti-Semitic group composed of nationalist leaders who could prove their lineage back to the founding of the country. The organization was very similar in nature to the Ku Klux Klan. The Order of 76 mailed copies of McFadden's speech to individuals including Jews, but also shipped them out in bundles. Golden had met several times with a man named William D. Pelly, the leader of a group called the Silver Shirts, a white supremacist, anti-Semitic organization. The paramilitary group was modeled after Hitler's Brown Shirts, the paramilitary wing of the Nazi Party. Pelly claimed that the purpose of the organization was to, quote, combat the inroads of communism, end quote. In testimony given before the Un-American Activities Committee later in the 1940s, Pelly would admit that he had been in constant touch with officials of the United States State Department, senators, and congressmen. He mentioned specifically Congressman Louis T. McFadden. The Order of 76 and the Silver Shirts combined into one organization. William Pelly's goal was to lead a march on Washington, overthrow the U.S. government, and become dictator of the United States, or the American Hitler. Pelly himself, a rabid anti-Semite, believed that Jews should be isolated in walled-off cities. The secret espionage society had Hitler agents as members and worked closely with secret German propagandists in the U.S. At its height, the Silver Shirts had 25,000 members nationwide. John Spivak, in his writings in 1934, gave evidence of 2 telegrams he had discovered. One of the telegrams was sent by Pelly to Louis McFadden at Moreland Park in Canton, PA, asking for advice. The other telegram was McFadden's reply. Pelly often quoted McFadden in his magazine Liberation, which was published in Asheville, North Carolina, by Pelly Publishing. The New York Times reported on a Nazi rally held under the auspices of the Friends of New Germany at Madison Square Garden on May 18, 1934. The event attracted 20,000 Americans who were Nazi supporters. The event was announced as a demonstration against, quote, the unconstitutional Jewish boycott of Germany, end quote, which had occurred due to the Nazis' treatment of the Jews. The leader of the Friends of New Germany at the time was Reinhold Walter. Toward the end of the meeting, Mr. Walter read several telegrams, one of which, he said, came from Representative L.T. McFadden of Pennsylvania. Representative McFadden regretted his inability to attend and said he was sure, quote, millions of Americans will join with me in voicing opposition to any attempted boycott of German goods in this free country of ours, end quote. The Jewish Telegraphic Agency, a Jewish correspondence bureau, wrote in 1934 that McFadden believed an increasing number of Jews were occupying key positions in all departments of United States government, and believed this would lead to an overthrow of the government by communistic Jews. Despite all of this, McFadden denied that he was personally anti-Semitic in an interview with a Jewish telegraphic agency in May. Quote, some of my best friends are Jews, McFadden explained. He also denied that he had any connection with the Silver Shirts, but on questioning, he admitted that he knew William Pelly. The agency went on to report, quote, a leading Washington editor expressed the opinion that McFadden is a crank, whose word counts for little. Another editor described the congressman as a lunatic. After 2 conversations with the man, I would entirely discount the latter critic's assertion, but with regard to the former, I can subscribe to the crank part, but not entirely to the statement that his word counts for little. McFadden is neither wild-eyed nor erratic in action. At times he can be one of the most effective spellbinders on the House floor. I don't know what incident in his life embittered him against the Jews, but I do know that he so cleverly combines his hatred with good rhetoric that he's gaining some following. If the American Nazi Revolution should ever come, McFadden may well petition for a place high among those being rewarded for leading the revolution." End quote. A Central Press columnist, Charles P. Stewart, had taken a liking to Louis McFadden after having interviewed him many times. He wasn't so fond of what he called McFadden's anti-Semitic bug. He said McFadden hated J.P. Morgan and anything connected with him. Stewart never could quite convince McFadden that J.P. Morgan wasn't Jewish. "How do you know they're not?" shot back Louis one time, as if giving me a tip. "Maybe you suspect," I observed sarcastically, "that the name Morgan was Morgenheimer originally?" Then the chat drifted back to something rational. As it ended and I was leaving, Louis stopped me with a suggestion. "Say, I presume you're aware that the Morgan's name was Morgenheimer." Can you beat that? I'd fed him that idea. He'd assimilated it as his own, and forgetting who provided him with it, was handing it back to me for my information. McFadden despised J.P. Morgan, just as he did most wealthy people, but especially since Morgan was in favor of creating the Federal Reserve System. Among the companies that J.P. Morgan owned was the White Star Line shipping company that in turn owned the ship RMS Titanic. 3 wealthy Jewish Americans had boarded the Titanic for its first trip across the ocean: John Jacob Astor, Isidor Straus, and Benjamin Guggenheim. There are conspiracy theories that are still kept alive today, which state that J.P. Morgan caused the Titanic to sink so that he could eliminate these 3 men and cause the Federal Reserve plan to move forward. Obviously, it's a ridiculous notion. Nevertheless, the National Reserve was created about a year after the sinking of the Titanic. On August 2, 1934, as Adolf Hitler declared himself dictator, the Philadelphia Council of the American Jewish Congress was protesting against Louis McFadden's restoration to the front ranks of the Republican Party. McFadden had won the Republican nomination from his district at the spring primaries, but was unable to carry Columbia and Montour counties. What was known as the Horseshoe District now included the counties of Columbia, Montour, Sullivan, Bradford, Wayne, Pike, Wyoming, and Susquehanna. Columbia and Montour were overwhelmingly Democratic, and a Democrat would be running against McFadden in the fall. This was a concern, since McFadden was unable to carry Columbia and Montour in the spring primary. The Republican Party was reinstating McFadden with all of his congressional privileges, because after all the punishments they had given him, they now needed him, due to his strong stand against Roosevelt's New Deal, which he said was lowering Americans' standard of living. Unfortunately, it was too little, too late. John Spivak had written an article titled, "McFadden, Jew-Baiter and Crook." The story was part of a series of articles that were later combined into a booklet titled Plotting America's Pogroms. This article traced McFadden's questionable business practices and his connections to Nazi-related organizations. As Spivak prepared to print this article, he called McFadden at Moreland Park by long distance to schedule an appointment to discuss the charges he was making in the article. McFadden answered the phone himself. "Spivak, eh?" McFadden said. "Well, I don't know where I'll be. I'll be down in the district campaigning, so I won't be able to see you." "But you have an itinerary. Certainly you must know where you'll be during the next few days," said Spivak. "I don't know where I'll be," McFadden repeated. "What is it that you want to see me about?" "The New Masses is running a series on anti-Semitism in the United States." Yes, I know. "I'd like to interview you since you were the only one who brought up the subject in Congress." "That wouldn't do me any good. Wouldn't do any good," he caught himself. There are also some very grave charges against you, and I think you should have a chance to answer them. Oh. There was silence at the other end of the wire. Then, I have nothing to say. I'll take a chance on finding you in the district. Suppose we make it Wednesday. I don't know where I'll be. Good night. The telephone clicked. He had hung up. Wednesday morning I appeared in the little town of Canton, where the congressman had conducted so many of his borrowings for his own companies from his own bank on his own signature. His wife did not know where he was and had no idea where he could be. From other sources I learned that he was to be in Athens that night. When I got to Athens, he had already spoken and left hastily. Inquiries in the adjoining town of Sayre, where his campaign manager happened to be, met with the information that the congressman was gone. No one knew where. Right in the middle of a political campaign, a congressman had vanished. For a while I thought seriously of reporting his disappearance to the police. Despite all the precautions the congressman had taken, a man walked over to me in the hotel where I was having a late lunch and whispered secretly, "You looking for Louis McFadden?" I nodded. "He's apparently trying to avoid someone," he whispered through the corner of his mouth. "But you'll find him in Wayne County." With that, my mysterious informant vanished. Wayne County was something like 100 miles away, almost at the New York and New Jersey border, and the farthest part of his district in that direction. It would take at least 4 hours driving to get there. I was tempted to leave immediately, but wondered why I had been singled out for that little bit of information, and I telephoned a man in Wayne County who would know if McFadden was expected that night. No, McFadden was not expected. As a matter of fact, he knew that McFadden was to be in Towanda, not an hour's drive from Sayre, at 6 o'clock that night to see a man. Why my mysterious informant wanted to get me off to the other end of McFadden's district, I do not know. At any rate, I went to Towanda, but by the time I got there, the congressman had just vanished again, this time into thin air. It was really funny, this vanishing congressman who hopped from place to place like a flea trying to escape answering questions. In the final days of McFadden's 1934 campaign, 43,000 copies of John Spivak's article, "McFadden, Jew Baiter, and Crook," were reprinted and placed in the mailboxes of all voters in McFadden's district. According to Spivak, quote, "the swing vote against McFadden developed immediately," end quote. After 20 years, McFadden was defeated by C. Elmer Dietrich, who had carried the Democratic strongholds of Columbia, Montour, and Pike. An Associated Press article out of Towanda stated, quote, "Re-election hopes of United States Representative Louis T. McFadden, called the bad boy of the Republican Party, for his 3 efforts to impeach former President Hoover, were quashed today," end quote. He left office at the beginning of 1935 and returned home to Canton, Pennsylvania. A year later found McFadden trying to earn the Republican nomination to retake his seat, but was unsuccessful. He did earn the Prohibition nomination, and his name was to be added to the ballot in the fall of 1936. At the end of September 1936, Louis and Helen McFadden, with their son Theodore, left Canton on a visit to New York City. On October 1st, Louis McFadden suffered a heart attack in his suite at the Lexington Hotel. He was rushed to the hospital where he died at the age of 60. Newspapers across the nation carried the story of his death. The funeral was held Sunday afternoon at Moreland Park with interment in the East Canton Cemetery. William Pelley took the opportunity of McFadden's death to write the following piece of propaganda in his magazine, now called Pelley's Weekly. Quote, "Now that this sterling American patriot has made the passing, it can be revealed that not long after his public utterance against the encroaching powers of Judah, it became known among his intimates that he had suffered 2 attacks against his life. The first attack came in the form of 2 revolver shots fired at him from ambush as he was alighting from a cab in front of one of the Capitol hotels. Fortunately, both shots missed him, the bullets burying themselves in the structure of the cab. He became violently ill after partaking of food at a political banquet at Washington. His life was only saved from what was subsequently announced as a poisoning by the presence of a physician friend at the banquet who at once procured a stomach pump and subjected the congressman to emergency treatment," end quote. Every article that discusses McFadden's alleged assassination uses Pelley's comments as fact rather than what they are, mere propaganda. John Spivak would later write, quote, "Of course this was crazy, but the coal digger in Kentucky, or the farmer in the Middle West, or the unemployed worker in an industrial center, when they were told by newspapers brought to them by the United States government mail that their economic difficulties were due to a Jewish communist plot, some of them were prone to believe it. With this irresponsible propaganda, anti-Semitism grew. Men and women were attracted to the Nazi web without dreaming of the forces disseminating the propaganda and the motives behind them." End quote. 2 years after Louis McFadden's death, 30,000 Jews were sent to Nazi concentration camps. Of these, 2,000 were dead within a month. In December 1941, routine gassings of Jews by Nazis began. The United States entered World War II. Had McFadden lived longer than he did, what would he have thought about these developments? In September 1938, Helen McFadden, who had been left with an estate by her husband that carried more debt than it had in assets, sold Moreland Park for $1. She died in 1962. Today, Moreland Park and McFadden Road in Canton exist as reminders of yet another fascinating period in the history of Bradford County, Pennsylvania.